Hello and welcome to another cool rock podcast. I'm your host, Steve Roth, and I am so psyched to bring you this interview with Ross Warner, author of the absolutely terrific book, American Standard, Cheap Trick from the Bars to the Budokan and Beyond. Now, I have to preface and fully disclose that my all-time favorite band of all time is the mighty Cheap Trick, as you'll be able to tell pretty quickly in this episode. I really enjoy getting into deep conversations with anyone about the band, and even more so here with Ross, as his book is just fantastic. American Standard tells the unlikely story of Cheap Trick's path to greatness, from their origins in Rockford, Illinois, to their massively successful live album At Budokan, to the many, many ups and downs that followed. And as we get into here, there were a lot of those ups and downs. In the book, Ross tells a rollicking tale of artistic genius, rock excess, hilarious misbehavior, chance encounters with music's biggest names, and international stardom that brought new meaning to the phrase big in Japan. Drawing on exhaustive research and interviews, American Standard gives an intimate look at a truly original band, whether you consider them rock icons or criminally underrated. The book gives such a detailed account into the biggest, most exciting, and also very frustrating time in Cheap Trick's career, when the out-of-left-field success of At Budokan, a live album that wasn't supposed to be released in the U.S. at all, changed everything for the band, put them under the microscope in ways they hadn't been before, and also delayed the release of the follow-up album, the album that became one of my favorite Cheap Trick albums, Dream Police. I loved talking to Ross about all of that, and so much more about Cheap Trick. I could have talked to him for several more hours, but without further ado, here's my conversation with Ross. And be sure to check out American Standard, available at Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, Bookshop.org, and your favorite independent bookstore can order it as well. Ross, I'm thrilled that you're here. I'm gonna try to keep myself in check because I can talk about Cheap Trick forever. And first off, the bona fides, if you will, how many times have you seen Cheap Trick? If you wrote a book about Cheap Trick, it's because you love them.
Right. No, I said I have seen Cheap Trick. I think grand total 10 times, which is nothing. Which is absolutely nothing. Now I again come to them from I saw 138 Grateful Dead concerts, so that which is not a lot in the Grateful Dead world.
No.
I've seen 50 Allman shows. I just went to the 2 Nights of the Brothers at the Garden. I've seen Springsteen over 50 times. So with Cheap Trick, I would say I've seen them about 10 times, and I'm including some mini shows in there. I saw the Town Hall thing in 2001 where they did the acoustic. I'm including their in-store appearance at the Virgin Megastore in 03 for Special One. So I didn't see them as many times as I could, but I also think, and we can get into this, that I don't for one second think that I am either the best writer or the biggest Cheap Trick fan, but I think I certainly understand enough of what everybody else loves about them, and I certainly understand, obviously, from coming from the Dead world. Although Bun, from our communications, I think he doesn't find this comparison. Is Rick, of course, for years, like if you'd ever said about Grateful Dead, they were just this noodling bunch of idiots that he would never be able. But Bun, I think, understands not only their musical actual place, but also the fanaticism that follows them. But you mentioned Carla Dragati, and obviously she, I think, organized those Trick Fests, and there were a lot of articles I remember reading, in the mid '90s about how Cheap Trick in some ways became like the Midwestern Grateful Dead. Like there were people following him around, hoping for that one version of he's a whore, I'm sorry, or something they wouldn't play like that, like a Holy Grail Fan Club, which wouldn't come out until a little bit later. So I've seen them 10 times. My bona fides for Cheap Trick, like I said, as I got into them, as I put into the book, I first heard them seeing Up the Academy on HBO, the Mad Magazine movie, which is one of the all-time
worst movies.
Yeah, I just watched Roadie recently, and that's not good. And I watched even Cheap Trick is not in it, but I watched FM, which is not great either. It really wasn't until later. I was living in East Village, right where the Fillmore East was, in the late '90s, which was a great time to live in the East Village. And I used to always go to the CD stores that would sell the promos. They would immediately get, they would have the 2 notches in them. And I bought the complete concert of Cheap Trick, and I had the tape of Budokan too. So I was aware that there was this other side of Cheap Trick. The Auf Wiedersehen, the High Roller, the much gnarlier, not
darker.
And then when I heard it all together in a row, not knowing what dates or what who produced it, whether it be Jack, that's really when I started to get into them. So my first Cheap Trick show was '99. At the Hammerstein Ballroom with Guided by Voices opening. And then in that little mini period, between 99 and '05, when I moved out of the city with my wife, is when I saw them like a lot. I saw them at the town hall, and then the next night at Irving Plaza. I saw them at the Snapple Sunfest in Newport, which was essentially just a tent in a parking lot that Cheap Trick played, which is like the most Cheap Trick thing in the world.
Right.
And then I saw them open for Aerosmith. As I was looking at like an old Brave Words article, and I mean, yeah, Tom was there, I'm pretty sure, but I was looking back. I guess Tom had taken some time off, and John Brandt had played on that Honkin' on Bobo tour. So I was like, did I see a show without Tom? But I don't think so. I think he played that night. And then the last time I saw them with Bun was the aforementioned Farmingville Alice Cooper set. And then I didn't go once Bun left, and I wasn't sure I was ever gonna go. And then before I was even like going to write the book, when I was thinking to write the book, I went to see them again, and it was different, you know. And I
Yeah.
get into that too. I don't think that Bun wants to be touring with Cheap Trick right now. He certainly didn't want what happened to happen. I don't think, you know, the narrative that Dax was replacing Bun, or that, you know, I don't think that's the case. But it was
Well,
different. It was different, and they still bring it. I mean, going to your very last question as to what's left for them, you know, they don't share that with me in my relationship with them, because I think I know they're aware of the book. I think it was Carla, because I had emailed like their AOL like Trick touring.
yeah.
And I was like, "Is this Carla?" And it was almost like, you know, it was like a full on like weird like dark web. And she's like, "Yeah, you could send them to our offices in Wantagh, which is like, you know, near here. It's where Sonny Corleone was shot on the Causeway. It's near Jones Beach." I was like, "Okay." So I mean, I think they're aware of it. I know Ken Adamany, who I did speak to a lot, who obviously, you know, parted ways with him. I know, you know, him and you know, he's actually been a little bit in touch with Robin and his wife Pam. So yeah, there's a little bit of thawing. I don't think the
Yeah.
poor guys will ever get on stage again. But
Yeah. Well, we'll speculate
yeah.
as far as where they're at right now.
That's
But
yeah. How many
yeah.
shows I've been to? 10. The last one being I saw them in New Hampshire opening for Rod Stewart, and then in the post Dax Nielsen, you know, coming into the band. The one time I saw them headline was out here in '03. I saw them. There's a great recording and video. It used to be the Westbury Music Fair in May of 2023. So that was
Right.
and I mean, it was really good. I mean, you could tell, like you said, you know, I mean, I wish Robin would sing Down, but I understand that's the song he's kind of like giving to his son.
Yeah.
The joke, or even not the joke, the compliment with Robin was that his voice never changed. I think it finally has a little, because it changes for everybody.
Yeah.
You can
Yeah.
hear even on the recording, like the parts where, like, you know, where Robin Taylor's like voice almost like scaffolds Robin's. It's like,
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
I mean, they're still awesome. Obviously, they don't dial in anything. You know, I mean, I don't think that anyone who's ever seen them has ever said that they were like low energy.
Right.
You know, obviously Rick is not going to always be able to run around with a giant 5-neck guitar. You know, again, I mean, I'm sure the wear and tear. I would hate to be Rick's like, you know, chiropractor, because I'm sure
Yeah.
I think it's
He
taken a serious toll on him.
Yeah, you could see it physically if you've seen in the last couple of years. I mean,
Yeah,
he's notably slowed down, but that's the aging process. The guy's 80 years old at
right.
least. But
Not everybody can be Mick Jagger. Only Mick
yeah,
Jagger.
exactly. That's the freak of nature there. So, um, but let me get into the book, because first off, I love this book. And of course, it's all in the show notes. American Standard, from the bars, Cheap Trick from the bars to the Budokan and Beyond. Like I said, I absolutely love this book. I thought I knew a lot about the band, because I have been a fan since I was 12 years old, right about the time when Budokan broke. So I'm a few years older, but I learned so much, especially about what the time period for the band that was, you know, at times triumphant, momentous, exhausting, and frustrating. And that was 78, 79 when Budokan blew up through the release of Dream Police. And you so document that so greatly, and your sources were fantastic, especially the you mentioned their then manager Ken Adamany, but also the folks from Epic Records, that the retired record execs who were there at that time. And this could be a much longer winded question, and hopefully I'll touch on
Yeah,
these points,
and it could have been a much longer winded book.
yeah,
And that
but
is
you did some great digging there. I mean, it kudos to your investigative prowess. I mean, how did you find these guys? I mean, how did this evolve?
I mean, the whole thing started, honestly, my first thought was I wrote a book called Drunk on Sunday, which was a fictionalized, but not that fictionalized story of growing up, living in Chappaqua, becoming obsessed with the dead, which is, again, it's almost like, you know, that's, you know, repetitive. I mean, everybody who's into the Grateful Dead generally is obsessed with them, but also being
Sure.
simultaneously obsessed with the then San Diego Chargers. Dan Fouts and growing up and kind of learning as I got older, that maybe my interests weren't going to be my only identity. And it was 2020, and I was speaking to Chad Cushins, who wrote a biography of Warren Zevon, who I love, and one of my, big, much like people with Cheap Trick before they were inducted. I still can't believe he's on the Hall of Fame. But we were talking, and he said, "Would you ever think about doing a rock bio?" He's like, "I know you seem to like this auto fiction, Hunter S. Thompson, but not quite, approach to writing. Is there a band you think that does not have a biography that deserves one?" And at the time I said Cheap Trick, not knowing, I mean, obviously reputation is a fragile thing, is essentially, out of print and only available to those, who wrote it. I mean, even, I don't think even Mike Hayes or Ken Sharp,
Yeah.
I know they released it. I wasn't aware of Robert Lawson's book at the time that I said that, although I did eventually buy it. And so I spoke to everybody who wrote about Cheap Trick.
Sure.
And I wasn't aware that Doug Broad had a book coming in 2020 because I didn't know who Doug Broad was. And I certainly didn't know about Brian Cramp's plan. So I started looking into that. And so during the pandemic, because I wasn't really, I was promoting my other book, but I had more time. I started going into old articles, and I spoke to Tom Bajour, who now has the book out on Lollapalooza. He is a huge Cheap Trick fan. The reason I got to him, or how I got to him, was Alan Paul, who has been so nice to me, is a biographer of Stevie Ray Vaughan and the Allmans, and he wrote a book originally about his experiences, which I didn't know about, called Big in China, about going to China and loving the blues, and it was optioned by Ivan Reitman and never made it into a movie. So I just started bugging him, which is kind of the dominant narrative in all this. Like I didn't know him, I just started bugging him. I was like, you're Jewish, I'm Jewish, you like the Steelers, I like the Chargers. We started going back and forth. Turned out I got into Government Mule when he got into Government Mule, and I met him in a concert, and he just kept answering my questions and phone calls and texts. And so his intern originally at Guitar World, I think, was Tom Bajour, and he was like, "I have a buddy, or I have a friend, Tom Bajour, who's not quite successful. He did the Nothing But a Good Time book that
Right.
and he's a huge Cheap Trick fan. He's like, you should talk to him." So I got to him, and then he was like telling me names that I wasn't quite familiar with. Ken, Carla, I forget who else. So I originally wanted to, and now's the long-winded answer, not the long-winded question. I wanted to originally write about Budokan because I realized that A, it's what everybody knows, and B, there's so many myths about it to this day. I mean, I just came into, I can probably get you a copy, the audience version of the first night of Budokan, and one of the most central, besides being discovered in a bowling alley by Jack Douglas, which is also not, true. One of the most oft-told stories, oops, sorry, I left you there, of by Cheap Trick, is, well, we weren't going to play I Want You to Want Me. The promoters asked us at the last second to add it into the set. We just decided to do it. And that is patently untrue. I mean, to the point where I put in the book, I've seen, not only there was an article, sorry, not Tom Hurwitz. Eric Hurwitz wrote for Mix Magazine, which I saw years ago, that has Ken Adamany's actual rehearsal set list and a picture of them rehearsing before the first night. And then I dug deeper. I saw a review of the Roundhouse show, which the photo is on the cover of my book. They played it then. I recently saw they played it in Newcastle, and they played it, of course, on Old Grey Whistle Test. So, the fact that they would kind of lean into that, and also lean into the whole idea of they didn't plan on it coming out. It was supposed to be an import, but again, like everything Cheap Trick, they never let the truth get in the way of a good story.
Right.
Rick, and I asked Ira Robbins this, who I was able to get to through. I think I just tracked him down because I certainly am not cool enough to have grown up with Trouser Press, and he's an amazing writer.
Big Cheap Trick fan, was huge. A big part of their.
He helped break them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he had sent me a message recently, wow, you really did the research and listen to all the bootlegs. And I was like, well, I'm a deadhead. I'll listen to bootlegs, but thank you.
Right.
that is the highest, and I told him jokingly, but it wasn't joking, how many different paywalls I scaled to get at these old newspapers. I think going on newspapers.com, I used every one of my kids' like names, like their debit cards, just to like get the 7-day trial. So I have more
Right.
PDFs, and they're great because they're such a time capsule of the 70s. It'll be like, Cheap Trick appearing, like there's a fondue restaurant, like Spy Love Me in a drive-in, like
Right.
porn theater, and I'm like, it's great, like Robert Evans arrested, like they're all in one page, right? So I got at some of those names, probably Jim Charn. I spoke to. I didn't get to
Who's-
Ken Anamani, I have to say, and again, I know Carl or anybody. Ken Anamani is a huge figure in the Cheap Trick story, and
Oh, absolutely. Their manager for a long time, and it
yes,
did not end well. And they
not in well, and
famously, and I was going to mention this too, and this kind of dovetails into what you uncover in the book so much, and that is, I mean, Cheap Trick Forever, besides being very private, which so many bands were back then, and there was no internet back then, you had to have some mystique, but they were very private. But they, for decades, have always practiced a very revisionist history when it comes to their career missteps as well as their amazing successes.
right,
So, and
and that goes with Started Country, and that also goes honestly with, and I put it right there in the forward of the book. That also goes with like stories of like who did what, like who again, like as I tell people, you know no band of that era tells people like they didn't party, they didn't do this or that.
right,
Trick always has, but then if you look at interviews with them, they get kind of pissed when it goes too much the other way. Like, like, oh, we weren't angels. Like I think Robin's in an interview that I might not have quoted where he jokes, but it's like everything with Cheap Trick, it's a joke with the truth wrapped in. He's like, look, the only difference is, we didn't stop doing drugs. I mean, I don't think
right.
Cheap Trick did anything. You can read a book, Eddie Trunk talked about hanging out with Rick, his ability that he even said in the original fake epic bio for like drinking beers was pretty legendary. He could put away an insane amount of beer, and
I can tell you very quickly that I had the pleasure back in my record industry days of bumping into the band in, of all places, Amarillo, Texas. And he com this was back when he drank, and I was flabbergasted when he announced around the time, I think it was the Red Ant record, kind of said out loud in interviews, which hope we'll get into this in a second, the way the interview and media kind of access has changed there. But at at the time he said, I stopped drinking, but he drank me under the table. I mean, what kills me is that there's so much I don't remember that that I get to sit next to in a booth of all places in Applebee's in Amarillo, Texas, giving Rick setlist suggestions because he asked, and I have such a vague recollection because I've always been known as the Two Brew Jew, and
you should definitely
here
market that. That's
here's a legend next to me for God's sakes. So, but yeah, they were no angels. And when you get to know other musicians and other people through the years, there's some, there's plenty of stories about virtually all of them out there where you go, oh man, that's really
right.
different.
And
And it's like that about a lot of bands. Not every band's Aerosmith, where, this was completely, all
I
that was completely in the open
I
publicly.
think, and this is again, I've said in interviews, and I have nothing to back this up. I think it's just a matter of, you mentioned Aerosmith. When they joked about being asked to do, behind the music, and Rick would say like, we don't want to become one of those bands. I think in Rick's mind, especially, and I asked Ira Robbins this, and I don't think Rick is, so dictatorial, at least now that he speaks for the rest of the band. But I think that, once certain images of them, realistic or not, got out there, he would for the most part stick to them. The stories about like how they got the band name. You'll read interviews with him from back in the day. He'll admit like, I tell these stories. He's very like, again,
Sure.
he was the dirty, and I put in the book, he was, in terms of his humor, the dirty grandpa, long before he even had children, let alone grandchildren.
Right.
I think, quite bluntly, like you said, I met Mike McCready, who wrote the forward for my book, who I am not like friendly with. If you read his story, he'll talk about like being extremely I could say fuck, I assume, extremely fucked up in public, and like going to Hazleton and wanting to be an example for others. Like, that's not who Rick Nielsen is. Like, there
No.
isn't Rick Nielsen. You are much closer to than I ever have been with me. But I don't think he really wants that out there. He's not looking to be either anybody's political, chemical, emotional, like, role model. I think, he wants to keep that private. I don't think he wants people to necessarily get. So I've always thought that he thought if people knew they partied, then it would just become another rock and roll cliche. As much as he loves Joe Perry and Steven Tyler, his idea of them turning up in the in the magazines would detract from what they were trying to do. I think it's the same reason they kept making albums, even with varied success, because to him that was the way of going, they would become just like another, legacy act before that
Right.
thing.
Well, I mean, there's something very admirable about that, and that I found very appealing. I wasn't necessarily an impressionable kid, but at a time when I was, really getting into music, and all you hear about is these legendary exploits, everything you read from, Led Zeppelin to Van Halen to, I was always a big Kiss fan, and how Ace Frehley and Peter Criss fell apart and fell down. It was like the fact that none of this was that I had any, the fact that I never even knew any of this, but that there was no public ugliness. I actually really liked as a fan. You know
Well,
what I
and then,
mean?
then they got what they wanted, because I still see,
Yeah.
whether it be like on a Steve Hoffman's forums or like or even a Kiss forum, you still see people out there who buy that. They're like, wow, Cheap Trick is the only band to never have drama. I was like,
No, they had
as
a lot of
I
drama.
tell people, the only people that talk shit about the people in Cheap Trick are the other guys at Cheap Trick. I mean, which again, I did put in the intro. It's Rick's prerogative. We're only focusing on Rick because he's the most quoted and the most public. It's his prerogative not to tell people how or why he got sober or how he came to becoming a vodka pitchman. And again, that's his prerogative.
Right.
But
Yeah.
but it's always been a slippery slope with him, because, like I said, if people accuse them of being angels, and sometimes they do because of the image they've tried to protect, then they'll take issue with that. Like, oh, we weren't like that at all. I mean, Bun, again, there's a common theme here. People who are no longer part of the machine are a little bit outspoken. And Bun will say, yeah, I smoked weed with John Lennon, whatever. I mean, like, which I guess they were somewhat upfront about that. But
Right.
I think what you said about their missteps, I think Ira Robbins, in the book form of his notes for Sex, American Cheap Trick, he had said something in the intro, because when he interviewed them, they were clearly on the outs with Ken, and he noticed, they were much more frank than usual. And he said something in his own words, like, when they don't think they can gain anything from a relationship, they're going to be very, very, frank or downright vindictive. Once
Vindictive, and also they're, like I said, revisionist history, and also they tend to. And I always hated seeing this, especially when it comes to, and we'll get into this, I'm sure, with Dream Police, with Tom Werman, who produced three of the greatest records ever that sound
you're very
brilliant,
mean to
that are
Tom
so
Werman, and
wonderful and
it
warm.
hurts him. I can tell you. I mean, he spoke to me a little bit for the book.
And you read Werman's book, and it's like he still has nothing but great things about this band. He
It's
absolutely loved them, thought they were the best band he ever worked
Yeah,
with.
I will say I mean,
And yet
he
they blamed Werman for
right.
the
I mean,
sound and softening and
yeah, right. And as I put, and I've seen, comments from Jack Douglas, and like I said, if Tom Werman is the villain in the Cheap Trick board story, Jack Douglas becomes their hero. Which is not to say that Jack Douglas isn't hugely influential. Obviously with John Lennon, obviously with Aerosmith, he made that debut album. But if you read also interviews with Jack Douglas, and everybody but Bun E. Carlos has leaned into this. He'll say, "Oh, I was in Waukesha. Someone told me to go see them." Like,
right.
that isn't true. Like,
No.
Ken Anamini literally keeps the receipts, as I put in the book. Like, I have seen the limo bill. I have seen the letter dated February 11th, 1976. Jack, we're looking forward to having you. Why is that a big deal? I guess again, Jack is older, and he's always been this way. It's just anything that nicks away at. I mean, he already has a huge legacy. Like, who am I to?
Yeah.
But it just isn't true. Like, and the same thing, like I said, with the story of "I Want You to Want Me," which is almost like the central. I know Brian Cramp, in his book, he had said that basically, which I think is true, that the arrangement, not the finger snaps, but the arrangement, "I Want You to Want Me," you can sort of hear it because it was out of the set list when they were recording it. I mean, it wasn't out of the set list the way they say it, or I mean, Bun admits it, but it came back, I think. I don't know if the old gray whistle test of March 29th, 78 is the first performance since fall of 77, but it came back. And when it came back, it had a little bit more, I think, of the tempo, or like you said, they're very, Tom Werman is the villain to everything,
Right.
and it's unfortunately not the only time it seems like a band has either re-recorded an album with him. I know Twisted Sister had that, or obviously he worked with Motley Crue, and
Right.
Rick and Robin sang on Dr. Feelgood. But yeah, it's mean and it's unnecessary, and Rick has been doing that. Mainly Rick, but Tom too. And I guess actually same with Robin for quite some time. And it does, you can tell, I put it in the book, and I thought it was very telling that, Tom said, I still have like Off Wiedersehen like on my workout playlist. And I was like, for all
Yeah.
the shit that they've said about you, yeah, and I think it really does hurt him. And it's so unnecessary, kind of like a lot of these either lies or revisions, because you can like the Tom Werman version of In Color or not. I think it's a little soft, but do I think for 1 second that he made changes to it without Cheap Trick knowing. No. What little I know about that band, Rick Nielsen, whether he was on the phone listening to mixes for Heaven Tonight before they went to Europe, which I think he wouldn't let anything get out there that was not he didn't consent to. So I do not think, and this is my opinion, that Tom Werman went back and changed and made I Want You to Want Me a different song, and then they found out it later. I think that I think they played the game to be a little more commercial.
And I think a lot of that was due, not necessarily. I mean, I think some of that was due to the fact that Epic Records wanted a hit. You have this punky, edgy first.
I mean, they had this awesome album that everybody loves now that was super, that was super dark and super loud and crunchy, thus the Jack Douglas, sound. And then, as they said, it didn't sell to anybody. And so they thought, let's go the other direction. Werman, and again, Werman is not, obviously he loved Aerosmith Rocks. He said that was his best favorite album. But Werman was brought on to do exactly what he did, whether it be Molly Hatchet or Nugent, to make hits. And I think I included a quote that Bun had given to maybe Steve Hyden, or, we knew what he was doing. We just thought it was dopey. Like, I mean, they knew. I mean, because if you know anything about Rick, and you know more than I do, I can't for one second think, especially someone as, just on top of everything, I was always thinking about ways to promote this band. Everything from literally being dressed like like a NASCAR with every advertisement. Like, he would never let that happen. So he may not have liked the results, and it's easier to go back after the success and say, especially in the 90s, when now they're getting known by all these harder edge bands who hate everything they did in the 80s too. I mean, you can't blame Tom Werman for The Flame or The Doctor. But, people are whispering in their ear, like, you guys used to be something, man. That first fucking album, like, he's a whore. And, like, so of course they'd be like, oh, In Color. I think it's also, as I wrote, it's also their biggest set of hit songs. Like the way Springsteen talks about Darkness. I mean, the best Cheap, obviously, they had not 4 full albums, but they had at least enough for the first 3.
Yeah.
Written. They did not have Dream Police ready. Jack Douglas didn't pass on Dream Police. Like, that's another Rickism, He loves again to blame everybody. We had all this ready. Bun, who I think, even if I'd met him in 1975, of those that did, I think would have been the most truthful. I think, he had his own image, but he was like, there was a little bit less determination to stick to the story. I think that the second album has so many of their greatest songs, and those are the versions that are out there. And I Want You to Want Me becomes the one that breaks them. But if they're not comfortable with those versions and they didn't sell, like, that was their one shot to get them out there.
And your book presents all that. What you were just saying, this stuff wouldn't get out there, because one of the big things I took away from your book is there's such incredible detail in there about how detailed oriented, and I don't want to say control freak, but I mean this in a good way, how detailed oriented both Ken Adamany and Rick were about every facet of the band.
Right.
And every step of the way what the band was doing. So I don't think for a minute,
I don't either. And I will say one thing that
they would bend to record company pressure, or maybe they all wanted the same goal. Everybody believed, especially Epic, who worked their asses off for them. Everybody wanted to be this. Everybody who saw them freaked out about them. And
how do we market this? Right. They're looking at this thing. Yes. Rick sweaters were a conscious choice. There were other versions before it. Like I said, I mean, fortunately, you mentioned Jawbone Present, and Brian's book. I mean, fortunately, because originally what I wanted to do was just write about Budokan. I actually wrote a proposal to Bloomsbury, who since actually has bought Backbeat, the irony, and I wanted to just write about Budokan. It is crazy that there is no 33 1/3 about Budokan, if you think about it. Like, I love We Got the Beat and the Go-Go's, but like, in terms of, I'm not going to make Cheap Trick feel like a one-hit wonder, but Budokan is such a singular thing.
Put them on the map for millions.
It certainly deserves a book. But as I started to realize that maybe I had to expand it, speaking to Brian, I was very happy that he was focusing so much on the pre-Cheap Trick days. Because I had said to myself, like, I'm not the guy to do that book. Brian went after it with total forensic. I think I said, like, almost like podcast intensity. I'm not going to focus on that. The average person that knows Cheap Trick knows them from what they look like, 1979, Mike Damone and Fast Times, that's where they know them from. So I wanted to, attack that. But I will say, with Ken Adamany, I came into, Brian, I think, has jokingly said that he kind of softened Ken up, because Ken Adamany, anybody who met him back then, I know it's the way like Bill Ham was ZZ Top. I mean, he was, I get the impression that he's been nothing but nice to me, that he was one fierce mofo.
Hmm.
I even jokingly said to him, because he knows I love the dead, I was like, man, I was like, if I was selling t-shirts at a Cheap Trick show, you would have like thrown my ass in jail. Like, I was looking at like old billboards, and ironically, he loves the Allman Brothers Band, which I think is very interesting. That's one that we bonded over. But I look at like night, the Chicago International Amp shows, the ones the Disco Suck shows. There were all these stories of people getting busted. Like he was on top of everything.
Right.
And I know he could be very controlling, and I don't know the full story of obviously their separation. But I do know that now, I think he's 82. I mean, he's being a lot nicer to me. Like if I hadn't met him, I'm sure in 1977, I wasn't getting anything out of him. So
Right.
once, like when I speak his name to people, the Carrie Bakers, the Moira McCoy, people that tried to cover Chief Trick back in the day, they're like, I mean, he was tough. I know that they all, whether they tell me or not.
Y-
Jenny Lenz, who took the photo of Joan Jett and Rick Nielsen, Tom Peterson. She had mentioned something to me like, Ken was so tough with those photos. And she had been
Yeah.
around for
What
years.
what's amazing is that in particular Werman and Adamany, in particular Adamany, who, drew so much fire and ire from the band publicly,
Oh yeah,
the fact that he I'm sure there's tea to be spilled, but he, for you and also for Brian's book in particular, it was like, here's all the facts, man. For lack of, I mean, just
yeah.
the
I mean,
facts. Here's the
right.
facts. I mean,
It probably was money. I mean, I don't think he's ever spoke to me about it, and I don't. I mean,
well, there were
I didn't even.
lawsuits.
I think we asked like, did they feel they were shorted? I mean, I'm sure he had, and also I think one thing that and I'm not quoting something that shouldn't be. One thing that Ira Robbins had told me, and probably Carla could speak to this. I think this is the Ross Warner take that around the mid '90s, when they were, for the 85th time trying to restart their career, it was probably a part of them thought like Ken wanted them to be in the past. I know that he probably wanted them to, maybe look somewhat like they did in 1977. They wanted to embrace kind of a new thing. But I mean, yes, it got very ugly, and there are some, I mean, again, I'm not like I'm sure they signed some agreements to maybe not talk about each other, but if you
Yeah,
look
when in the lawsuit, sure.
right, but like I mean, I remember when I met them at the Virgin Megastore thing. I mean, the first thing that Rick Nielsen, and I don't think this is about Ken. I think this is about Dave Fry, the next guy. I think the first thing that Rick said, because he always went to the bathroom, was, "I had to go take an ex-manager." Like it was very,
Oh
like they
God.
are. I mean, if you listen to that Steve Dahl show they did in '99, 20 years after Disco Demolition, I mean, they are, and Tom's back in the band. They're ripping on Dagmar. They're ripping on. They're clearly ripping on Ken. They're basically calling him the Antichrist. Dax had just played. Before those Who 99 shows, the House of Blues. I think he played in Eddie Vedder's band. And again, like Eddie Vedder has a great sense of humor. And Rick is like ripping into him. I mean, sometimes I think, Rick also, I mean, there is something behind there. Like in the way he's a John, and I think I put in the book that he keeps telling everybody that the reason he went to play with John Lennon when Dax was born is that John is his hall pass. And I joked, I was like,
Right.
he makes as many sex jokes as Rick Nielsen. Can somebody whisper in his ear that that's not what a hall pass means?
Right. Right. Yeah.
My kids know what it means. So,
Right. Right.
um, but I think it's funny because you look at all those like shirts of, I'm not Paul, that he used to wear in the '70s, and then he'll talk about like going to George Martin's funeral and like being recognized by Paul McCartney. And there's a part of me that always wonders, like, is he just like wanting attention? Is he like a little sad that like Paul doesn't value him? Like, because he certainly
Hmm.
wants to be known by Paul. I mean, I think John Lennon more suits his jester punk style. I'm just saying sometimes when Rick lashes out, it's something I wonder, like, they might act like they were cool with how everything turned out, but at least for Rick, I'm sure he always wasn't. I mean, you could hear the hurt. Some of the interviews I heard that are still, the ones that they did in Japan, like around 88, 90, 90, 94, like they're not thrilled that their albums are bombing. And they're hurt that like whatever they're putting out there is being rejected. So
Oh, absolutely.
there's a
Yeah.
veneer, there's
And
a
it's totally understandable.
right.
I
There's a
mean,
veneer of sarcasm, as you know, that covers it up. It's a defense mechanism, but they might act like they were okay opening, for Rat, but they definitely were not okay opening for Rat. I am sure at the time
right.
they were like, how did this happen in 8 years? And I think what I tell people, if they ask, is I think maybe just the way they hit, and I do think Rick knew. I mentioned that Howie Klein interview where Rick said, like, we're gonna have 3 albums, they're not gonna hit, but then like one might hit, and people are gonna be like, oh yeah, that band. Like we'll go back and like they'll buy the old stuff. As you know, I think what happened is the way Budokan hit, They've already recorded an album. It's not done, but it's pretty much done. And they're basically held in stasis while they are the biggest band on the planet. And then by the time they're allowed to play this new material, they're sick of it. Tom's sick of it. And this obviously the other thing that I don't have information on, but like, you know, Tom was ready to leave and they're ready to get rid of Tom. I mean,
Right.
so now they're playing on the American Music Awards, they're playing the Texas Jam, they're playing the Coliseum, they're playing, you know, they're playing with John Lennon, literally, and they've already kicked Tom out of the band. And that, I mean, does that mean that he didn't also force himself out? I think it's a combination of both, but
Right.
it, you know,
So so that's a great
I think that
segue.
led to them being like very unmoored during the time that they, you know, but it's also something I think about, like, you know, who does get to have? I mean, the Stones went through periods obviously where they were still the Stones, and I saw them at the Tattoo You tour. Sorry, not Tattoo, Steel Wheels, but like, you know, they did obviously you know, they had their Harlem Shuffle period, you know.
Sure.
I mean, you know, Undercover is a fun song, but like nobody really remembers that now. They just remember them as an American institution.
Right. No, yeah, nobody's holding up Dirty Work as a seminal piece of
No,
work, the Dirty Work album.
right. So they
But
would had to have had some, you know, peaks and valleys, but with Cheap Trick, and again, this also might be a perception because they're defenders of every Cheap Trick period, you know, was that they basically went like, you know, AWOL in the 80s, which
which
they
they
did.
weren't.
They were there. They were playing, you know, everywhere. They were in every MTV spot, you know, they were
But
every.
that was also so this is a good segue because you brought this up, and I want to set the time frame. And this is what you detail in the book so so spectacularly. I think there's so much detail in there, and you really paint the picture, like I mentioned before, of just what the the Budokan time period through Dream Police time period was, everything from frustration to triumphant to just these career highs. So just to kind of set the stage, Budokan's released in the US, is released in Japan in October, starts to blow up on as an import. You really detail with the epic folks about how that happened
Yeah,
at
it's
the
on the radio.
Harvard Coop in Boston.
Right, there's like radio sampler
Yeah.
same time
And then
Trick or Treat.
yeah. And then it comes out in the US February 1979, which at that point they record Dream Police at the end of
Yeah.
78, done early 79. So Dream Police probably has a release schedule somewhere, you know, in the would have been in the spring, but doesn't come
Yeah,
out in
they're
September
talking
until
about
September, towards the end of the year. So as
it
you
wasn't supposed to
mentioned,
be September. They keep pushing it off.
right, it comes
Right.
out in September, but they kept pushing it back because of the
Right.
success of Budokan. What I wanted to ask you was, hindsight's 2020, and you go into such details here. I mean, what do you think the band and Epic could have or should have done differently?
I don't
Because
know.
you ride the wave, right? I mean,
Right. And that's again, and I think this also dates back to, you know, the Tom Werman thing. Because again, like the thing about Budokan is that, and again, I just listened to the actual audience recordings from the 28th, and I have one of the 30th, a piece of Osaka from the 27th. And something very interesting that not a lot of people know, because I don't think a lot of people have the audience recordings, and Bun does, is when they play I Want You to Want Me, that very first time, just for the first verse, they have Robin's voice echoed. So the crying, crying, crying is being piped out there.
right.
And then they baited the hook, or Jim Charn says seed in the market, and they don't do it for the other parts. And then when they play it on the 30th, the girls already know what to do. Now, they were doing this in the US years. Like when they came back, I mean, they were doing it like in the 2000s.
Yeah.
But it never appears on any of the releases, and it goes to show that like they knew a little bit more than they let on. And I think that's what leads back to the Werman hate, because that's the song essentially, the screaming. That's the hook of the record. That's what Jim Charn said. That's what, you know, if I put on WBAB, you know, 102.3 out here in Long Island,
Yep.
that's what's gonna be playing. And you know, but as Rick pointed out, you know, they knew the albums were being recorded, they knew it was gonna be a souvenir for the fans, and then they come back. I don't know how they could have done it differently, because I mean, I will say, even though it took me years to realize that there was a whole other sound to Cheap Trick, that album is still so infectious, you know,
Yeah.
and it's still so great that, I mean, how do you hold that back? But yeah, I remember reading, you know, you read all the trades at the time, the record worlds, and they would say like, you know, everything Dream Police is on hold. And I think I put in the book, you know, it's like the way that Axl Rose used to talk about, you know, Chinese democracy, or you know, the 4 hour cut of you know, Spinal Tap that exists. It'd be
Right.
equal in stature, as Rick pointed. I think it was the David Frick circus piece. He said like by the time Dream Police came out, it was so hyped. Nothing that we put on that record could have met the hype. So I don't know what they could have done because they get back here, and the problem with the whole Budokan thing, and I think one of the things they probably feel is that they really were the most hardworking, focused on success band, and the way that they broke made it seem so fluky, and that
Hmm.
and their goofy personas play into that. That there was so much like of a perception, like who are these guys? Why on the cover of a Rolling Stone? So I don't know. I know Brad Elvis, who he was friends with Bun forever, who played in the Romantics poster. What I like about you, period. Who was out in the bars in the '70s. He had said to me, maybe they could have gone back and fixed like Dream Police. Like if they knew now it was coming out, like they did Need Your Love, which of course everybody now heard.
Right.
Live on stage, and Rick would always say it's from our upcoming, album, Dream Police, coming out next month, and it wasn't. He probably thought it was, but like they kept
Sure.
putting off, and you can hear on the bootlegs, Rick is they're steering into the hype that Budokan is building. You mentioned Boston, like they're saying in every stop they go to, like there's this Japanese album that's hard to find, and that created a certain mojo. Like people, especially today, who love Record Store Day, who love to collect stuff. Obviously,
Right.
I used to keep. I had, I'm obviously a huge deadhead. I used to have Bed Bath and Beyond, like things of all my cassettes, and there was a definite coolness to being able to track down something that was hard to get. I know
And Cheap Trick fans are that way, as you know. I mean,
100%. That is the
I've been collecting stuff for
physically
years.
right. Physically, you want to put a different color on it. You want a checkerboard. It's like, yeah, 100%. And so were they, by the way. I mean, Rick, that was the thing. Rick, of course, know him better than me, but I mean, he grew up and is still a super collector.
Right.
That was
And Bunny too.
yeah,
Yeah.
100%. I had a taper. I mean,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
that Bun talks
We,
about, taping, certain bands, taping the Stones that and that's something that I find very cool, about him. But I don't know what they could have done because it was, again, I mean, even I'm a huge Springsteen fan. Even Springsteen he's releasing tracks too now, but he had to leave the E Street Band in the '90s, and the reason he's leave them behind, and now he's releasing his '90s stuff because people have said, well, he wasn't very active during the '90s. No, what they said during the '90s is he wasn't particularly good in the '90s.
right.
But
Right.
who can stay current at all times? So
Right. And
I don't know. It was just a perfect storm of them being huge, but it was also a perfect storm of knocking them off their ledge because again, Tom, and again, he's never spoken about it, but like certainly, you mentioned, I mean, Tom definitely was not satisfied. I don't know if reductive is the right word, but his wife, his then wife, wasn't necessarily the Yoko of Cheap Trick, although I think it's not cool to say, the Yoko was the Yoko of the Beatles, but it wasn't
right.
helping. He was in a bad marriage. It was coming out more when he drank. I do know there were several shows in 1980 that and I allude to it in the book,
Oh, yeah. That's a
he
great.
didn't,
There's
he
some
didn't
great
get,
anecdotes in
right,
there.
he didn't necessarily almost get to. And I know there were like game time decisions, including, I mean, the one in '79, the Winnebago County, Susan Messino talked about him just partying
Right.
his head off with
Bon
with
Scott.
Scott, which is like, I met Hunter S. Thompson in passing and have a great picture with him. But if I'd gone to like, gone to Hunter's estate and tried to keep up with Hunter, I mean, we know how
We
that went.
wouldn't be talking.
So, and again, I think that I don't know how they could have avoided it
I
because
mean, I,
I also think they ran out of material. That's also, I mean, if you listen to the 1980 sessions they did with Jack Douglas, which are crazy that they wanted to have other people record them. So it has, I did Go-Go Girls, which maybe probably would never have been a hit, but it has, their third version of Fan Club, and it has, does it have Such a Good Girl on it?
such a good girl. Yeah. The stuff that was on the EP and
So
the,
much better than what I mean. Everybody loves Stop This Game, but I mean, it's also that they kind of ran out of like
they
they
ran
don't
some,
bring a material that was again what he actually had written and what they used to tell people he had written is probably different. Like again, the legend always grew. Like, oh, we had Dream Police the song ready in 1976. I mean, Bun has been releasing in his Bunny's bootlegs every week stuff, which I assume it is quasi legal this way. I mean, they're where Cheap Trick's official socials,
yeah, which
but I don't think that's any. I
scares it.
mean,
Yeah.
and he has been going to he went to Robin Taylor Xander's show in Mary's. I mean, I wouldn't anticipate the four guys getting into a room
No.
again, but that isn't true. I mean, they didn't have the actual Dream Police that we all know and love ready in 1976. So I think I don't know. I know I'm all over the place with it, but I don't know if there's if they could have avoided it. I mean,
I
I think they didn't want to. They knew Rick knew that sustained success because I mean, some of the interviews that I put that you saw, they were worried about longevity. Like, if we're known for this fluky thing, if we're the band with the screaming guitars, sorry, the screaming Japanese girls, like, are people going to take us seriously? And I also think that, of course, is why they were so adamant about separating themselves from the Beatles, which is the genius of it, is that Rick is like the biggest Beatles fan.
Right.
Like, to
Right.
the point where like he had every collection. And so, as I mentioned to people, I mean, I was obviously 8 when Budokan came out. But I mean, I mentioned in the story, like Beatlemania, the play was a bit of a anomaly back then. Now you have obviously tributes to everything, but like
Right.
being called the next Beatles, I think there was a lot of, you know,
Boy, does that set the bar really high.
right. There was also all the people that wanted the Beatles to keep going. I think there were a lot of people, and you read those Dave Marsh reviews, like, oh, they took this part of, She's So Heavy, or I think a lot of people put on Cheap Trick, like, what if you could have taken the awesomeness of the heavy, dark Beatles in the White Album and the last 2 albums and like put that into like this whole new form of music? And I feel like that's what people put on that. When in reality, I would not have been cool enough to know who the Move were.
No.
Like
And I
I
was and I wasn't either.
they knew, oh, this is secondhand Beatles. They're getting it from Roy Wood. When I first started researching Cheap Trick, I was like, Roy Wood. I was like, they're not talking about Ron Wood. And again, the guys who did Reputation of the Fragile Thing, like he wrote the forward. I mean, that is like, Cheap Trick's big. That's
Oh, sure.
there.
That's one of the, to take a sidebar to the musicality of it. One of the things I've always loved about, and I didn't know it at the time when I was younger, of course, but one of the things I've always loved about Cheap Trick is between Rick and Tom, and especially Bunny, those guys are a catalog of licks and riffs. There's some great stuff on YouTube of Bunny doing drum clinics where
Yeah.
he's like, okay, the fill and such and such. Well, I nicked that from Dennis Wilson when I saw him in Chicago Stadium for the Beach Boys when he did
Yeah.
Do It Again or whatever. And so they always put those little things in there, whether, always before, unless it was an outright cover, they would put those little things in there. It wasn't a copycat. What it was a nod to how much they love that stuff. And
Right.
also, I think it was a bit of a cool trick to go to see if people could get it.
100%. This was, I put in the book. These were like your Easter eggs, right? This was
Right, exactly. There you go. Thank
right.
you.
Are you right? We could be the goofy guys here, but when Rick is playing, when he goes down, 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 down. Now, 1978, some people probably recognize, oh, that's the Beatles. From Me to You, it's on Budokan.
Right.
Like, there were much more. I mean, like I said, it's Big Eyes that they were like. Tom Peterson was like, it was at a Crawdaddy interview, and he said like, people claim we take stuff from the Beatles. Well, here's an example. Like, this was the Green Mile Leashy from the Peter Green. Like, we did it that way, and like, so yeah, it was definitely a way of saying like, are you cool? Do you get it? It was a way of feeling people out. Like, and that's why I think I kept going back. I was asked, I think it was the Freeform podcast, to come up with like 50 great Cheap Trick songs, and I was already thinking like, well, what do I do here? Because I was like, honestly, their first 4 albums have their best song. I mean, there doesn't mean there's no good songs post Dream Police.
Sure.
Like, you'd have a hard time telling me that. I mean, some of the stuff on the '97 album is great, but you have a hard time telling me that some of these like unattended like tracks from like Standing the Edge are better than anything that was on the first album. I mean, I know that I'll have to fill it out because there'll be people, understandably, so lists can do that to anybody.
Yeah.
They're gonna.
So it's interesting because when you talk about the Easter eggs, because years later when they would often decry Lap of Luxury, it starts, and they have said this as part of their criticism of it, is that, well, Let Go, the first song from the record, well, that's Rain from the Beatles. And then they'll decry The Flame, and because the beginning is, well, that's Nature's Way by Spirit. It's like, but you were doing this stuff, as a nod, so to decry it later. So
Yeah, and The Flame is a whole other thing. I mean,
yeah, well, that could be a podcast unto itself.
yeah,
But
I mean, right. So
when I
yes, and that also, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but like I remember there was a great bit. Diane McClain wrote it, but it was a Crawdaddy piece that I included where they're driving their RV, their beachcomber, they're dropping her off, and they're listening to like the Beatles on the radio, and yet at that time they're being asked about the Beatles all the time, and in that interview I think they said like people would compare it to the Beatles, and it must have like been frustrating for them because they
Sure.
had to, again, I think I allude it's a little bit like Springsteen being called the new Dylan. I mean, that's a no win proposition also, but
Yeah.
I don't. I mean, I'll ask you a question, but do you think there's any way they could have avoided the crash? I mean, of what?
That's a perfectly good question. Yeah, and folks, and you and I did not discuss this because you must be looking at my notes,
I'm
read
not.
my mind. Because here's my take on all this. And to answer your question, first off, no, it was inevitable, and I'll tell you why in a second. But first, when I look at what maybe they could have done differently during that time period, maybe Budokan should have come out at the end of 78. But at that point, they really did. It was starting to take off by then because people forget that Dream Police was a hit. It went platinum. It debuted number 6 on Billboard. But what happened was that dovetailed to what I'm going to get to in a second, and that is what I call the Fast Times of Ridgemont High Damone theory. Because let me set this up for you real quick. When Budokan comes out, 78, I get it on 8-track for for a birthday or Hanukkah or whatever. I am 11 years old. Okay. Fast forward about 5 or 6 years, right? Mid 80s. We're all teens. Everybody grew out of that stuff. This is the same thing that happened to Kiss, a combination of people growing out of kind of cartoony bands, becoming teens, right? And Budokan kind of set that up that way with the Screaming Girls, and they become heartthrobs. And you go from going into Crawdaddy to, because I collected all this stuff, 16 magazine pinup of Robin.
Yep.
Okay. So the fall is kind of inevitable. And it's so crystallized for me in Fast Times at Ridgemont. When Damone goes, "You mean you honestly forgot?" And the girl goes, "That's kid stuff."
Right.
That is it in a nutshell right there.
The
decline was coming.
right.
So fast forward a few years later, I'm class of 85, way out in Eastern Long Island. And I guarantee you that in 1984, 85, I am the only person within 100 miles that's walking around their high school with a Next Position Please t-shirt on. You
No,
know?
and I think you're
So it was
100% right.
inevitable.
And I mean, obviously, again, I put in the book that it's sitting over there. One of the first things that I did was I wrote Robert Romanus Damone. I think I mentioned this to you,
Right. Yes.
and he wrote me back. But as you know, again, and Cameron Crowe, obviously, it's Amy Haverkelling and Cameron Crowe. But I mean, yeah, I made the joke in the introduction that when Damone says that, of course, he's trying to fund an abortion, which is very.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, they needed some defending, right? And she says, if you got the tunes, and again, it's great, of course, but Cameron Crowe, when he wrote Fast Times, and I forget the name of the high school, I can look it up, but when he went and pretended to be in high school, the book of Fast Times, instead of the Pat Benatar look, it is the Robin Zander look. It talks about how all the boys have the
Yeah,
Robin Zander
I love that. I never knew that. That was
yeah.
one of the many things in your book where I went, wow, I did not know because
Well,
I wasn't in high school then. I mean,
did send
I
Cameron
started high
Crowe,
school
yeah, I did
81,
send a
82.
copy of the book. I don't expect I would get a response, but Alan Paul knew him because when he did his second book on the almonds, and because of all the almost famous almond stuff, he did give me Cameron Crowe's address, so I did send it to him. But yeah, it does sum it up because again, that's 1982, and like you said, they are very out of it, and even more so in 83, 84. And like you said, they are now known for the visual image, and which is crazy, because I did get a copy to Martha Quinn. In the 80s, the funny thing was, of course, is that they were almost tailor-made for the 80s.
Right.
They were
You
visual.
talk about that and it's perfect.
And
Yeah.
that's where I think the second book's really, because they were obviously on every spring break, hanging out with Martha Quinn. Rick has moved into what unfortunately we'll have to refer to as his Cosby sweater stage. But
Except for the doctor when, there was a stylized look there. So
yeah, I also had a theory that I brought up with, or Rick maybe, especially, he said he got heavier because he was pissed about Tom, which again, as you know, that's another Cheap Trick myth. I mean, Rick and Tom were best friends. Like the perception they put out to the world is that we're four guys thrown together, even the early Billboard, or the Eric Lusbader Vado says they met each other overseas.
no,
Rick
they
and
went
Tom were the
they went
best
to
of
London
friends.
together in the
Right.
late
They took
60s.
acid
Yeah.
and listened to you listen to the White Album, Becker's Banquet. So I would expect to have to sort of push Tom out of the band and to have him leave must have hurt Rick deeply. So
Mhm.
I have this, not a theory, but it's funny how Rick went from being the Hunts Hall, goofy, to when he got heavier, he almost became like the wrestling heel. He had the long beard with like the mini pearl tags in it and the glasses.
Right. Yeah.
I know he cut it off in 2001, but I don't know if that was like an escape mechanism, but yeah, I don't know. But I think the fact that we can even like have this just like constant back and forth just speaks to. I mean, see that the problem is that obviously all of their music I think holds up better than when it was released. I mean, the only thing that most Cheap Trick fans agree on is the '97 album is awesome, and it's so unfortunately Cheap Trick that 20 years from their debut, they release this thing, and then the second that comes out, the album goes
The,
put, and
the
then
label the label
right,
dies. I mean,
and
if there's something called Cheap Trick luck, that
yeah,
is it.
right, and they can joke about it, but obviously I'm sure that hurt them deeply. And whether or not I know that Rick says you let a lot of people down is is based on what his thoughts on Vietnam and Robert McNamara, which I'm sure it is, but Rick is not a super political person. I mean, so the question is where is some of that anger over how they things I did with Ken, because
I've heard that speculated, and it
that's
may have been mentioned
speculated. I
in an
didn't.
interview or two as well.
Yeah, and I've never, like I said, the problem with Cheap Trick, and I more than anybody, I think, just put it right out there, is that I mean, I don't expect them to ever talk to me. They could. I mean, I know, they're aware of it. I mean, I don't, like I said, I've told them like, it exists. I've contacted their people, but I felt like if they did participate, it would just be more hassle than it's worth. I mean, I know Doug's book, they seem just a little weird. I know Ira and Ken got Rick to speak with him, but I'm sure it was a lot of conditions. I think he told me, and a lot. Like, I don't think Rick is going to, at this point, is going to debunk any big long time stories.
No, and
So
that brings up something interesting I've noticed the last 4 or 5 years. One, especially the last 2 years, they're not doing any press, and they're rep by Big Hassle Media, which is one of the biggest rock PR
yeah,
firms
Ken
out there.
Weinstein was so nice. Is the guy that I said.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and it's interesting. Which at this point, I mean, at a time when there used to be a time where I would devour every single interview, but every Rick's interview, the last 5 or 6 years or so was
same
basically
story.
3 points. Yeah, John Lennon, my guitars.
100%.
We're
You know
too
what,
dumb. We're too dumb to quit, and it
right,
just
right.
got.
He's gonna do the fifth favorite band bit now.
Yeah, and
He's gonna
they're not even doing press to advance any of the shows right now. It's like which
yeah.
which they were doing up until about, I'd say, a couple years after COVID. And
Yeah, I asked Ira about that because I have seen like the original like proposal for a Cheap Trick book that he put together around 80. I think it was around the time of the Dream Police show, and it fell apart. I think because I think that probably Ken wanted, the terms were not favorable for Ira to write. Ira's a great writer, but I have Susan Messino, who obviously has become kind of the AC/DC Van Halen historian who I spoke to, who worked for
right.
Ken. I mean, she told me I had a
Great stories, by the way. The inner
yeah, oh
workings
yeah,
of the
and
office,
I
and
know,
the fan mail coming in, all
oh
that stuff that you
yeah.
detailed
Well, that
was
was what
so much fun to read. It gave, especially at a time now where everything's social media and email and everything else, it
right.
gave you a glimpse to what these folks on the ground
Oh
in
yeah,
the
and
trenches
it's
were
full
dealing with.
Madison, right? And we could also get it's just like the '70s show. It's full Madison wood paneling. I mean, I've not
Right.
seen the infamous storage.
But you can picture it so
Yeah,
easily. Your
she
book
said
paints
it was
such a
like
great picture
when I
of
spoke
it.
to her on the phone, I was like, so it was head to toe with mail. She's like, yes. Um, and then yeah, I mean, and she had said that she had a proposal. I forget which. I know one of her books is out by Backby, but she had a proposal. A coffee table book was going to be fully licensed, and essentially Robin's going to write the forward, and they just pulled out. Because I think this is again, supposition. I don't have any. They just at this point they they want it on their own terms. I think I even put in my book like everybody wishes they would write their own book, but I just don't think that's going to happen. And they'll talk to anybody about anything. I mean, like you said, podcasts like after COVID, like Rick will, if somebody wants to weigh in on on the Bears new draft class, Rick will probably do it. I mean, he is the
Right.
literally the Jimmy Buffett.
But now he's not. Now they're not doing that at all now, which I just find kind of interesting. The
Well, I know
last few
I saw
years.
on your Facebook that you were just at the Hard Rock.
Right. Yeah. We do. My wife and I took a drive down to this great convention, the Rock and Pod convention in Nashville, and we talked about this, and we'll certainly talk offline about this. But I actually work for a book publisher after years of being in the record business, and I can tell you some stuff. We were trying to do a book about Rick's picks, and I saw layouts when I first started for this company, and then it just kind of went away. Just don't even know the details. Different regime then for us, and it just. But yeah, we went to. There is this great public appreciation, especially obviously in Rockford. I mean, Rick is like the ambassador of that
All right,
city
he's
for
the Jimmy
goodness
Buffett. I
sakes.
used to say that.
Yeah,
He's the Jimmy Buffett of Rockford.
yeah, and so
The
yeah,
Swedish
so
restaurant, the
Swedish
pizza
restaurant,
place. Right. I
and
mean,
there's some amazing guitars that are now on display. A 58 Les Paul in the Hard Rock. Are you kidding me? So,
and I'm
but
actually going to Nashville, by the way, just separate aside. I've never been. but I was able to get tickets to see Pearl Jam in Nashville, which is I tell
Awesome.
people because of the, and again, I had not met Mike McCready, and the only reason I got him to do the forward was just pure persistence and annoyance. But I'm not famous enough to get free Pearl Jam tickets, but I have reached a level where I can bother them enough that I can face value Pearl Jam tickets for a sold out show. So that is my
Right.
level of fame. My 15 minutes, we're probably up years ago, but that's the.
Right.
My wife and I
So
are going in May. I've never been to Nashville, but everybody says it's so great.
yeah, it's amazing. If you heard the phrase Nash Vegas,
Yeah.
that's what Broadway, that's what downtown like. It's absolutely
Right.
crazy. And I did not know until we were physically there, but it is the bachelorette capital of the United States. If
Yes.
I see one more pedal pub going
Right.
around with a bunch of women with
If I
cowboy
don't
boots.
if I don't see a dildo shaped like chalice being carried, like, I'm gonna feel like but yeah, and I got to see a lot of the country on Dead tour, but I was obviously much younger, in my 20s, and so it was different. But
Yeah.
I'm not surprised by the Rick's Picks thing though, because like I said, I don't have an answer, but I think especially at this point, I saw an interview with Robin. It was in some Australian thing, and I alerted because everybody I will say who has written about Cheap Trick, because I do feel like I'm still somewhat of an outsider. And I think also that led to hopefully me being able to come at it a little bit different. I mean, I'm a huge Cheap Trick fan, but I did
Right.
really limit myself also. I mean, I listened to like every bootleg, and now the Bun's releasing them all. There was some I didn't get to, but like I limited myself to that, so I wasn't maybe so hamstrung it. But I certainly understood the cult, fanaticism. I understood like that whole you got to see a band live, and I felt that way about Cheap Trick. But when I spoke to Brian and I spoke to Robert Lawson and I communicated with Mike Hayes and Ken Sharp is a little bit. I think he's more like now he writes for magazines and the Kiss.
Right. Yeah.
So
Rock cellar and stuff. Sure.
yeah, so there wasn't a lot of all there was a little bit of like send me a copy of the book if we're going to use my stuff. That was basically the interaction. But I've seen a quote of Robbins from like 2021, and he said, all these people write books about us. Um, they usually ask Bun or maybe our former manager, but like I have all the good stories. Why doesn't anybody ask me? Which is the most Robin thing to say. Like everybody has asked you.
Right.
I literally
You're the second call after Rick. Are you kidding?
Right. Yeah, and I saw even like jokingly, and I know you're probably on the same Facebook groups I am, but those guys were joking with each other, like, "Oh, gee, I never thought
Yeah.
Robin Zander if he'd be in my book. Oh, do you think he would?" And like, and the mere fact that he knows the names of the books, but it suggests that like that it was kind of like, oh, they didn't reach out. Like again, and maybe there's a part of them that likes to have us guess, because like I said, I put in my book like I'm going to create, a narrative. This is my evidence, but I don't for 1 second think. I mean, Bun, I will say, when I communicated with him in Facebook, not if this was a question, I asked him to be in it and be quoted. And he kind of went forward with it. And he was like, and this is my impression of how he sounds. I've only spoken a couple of times, like, I don't want to deal with that. But then he proceeded to like basically answer every question I had. Like I was like,
Right.
this happened, this happened, this happened. And I said,
I
like,
think
are you cool with me? He just said you can say Carlos reaffirmed or Carlos. So he wouldn't be quoted same with Ken. Like Ken, and maybe this isn't the most journalistic. I let him read the manuscript. I didn't. He didn't tell me to take anything out. He didn't. But I
sure.
wanted it to. I was like, you want to see it? I was like, He's like, you have to promise you're not going to say anything that I don't want you to say. I was like, I won't. I'm like, but I was like, but there were certain things I wanted to know, like, oh. And then I said, like, oh, Rick claimed in '79 that they like remixed Dream Police with that Wormman, and like get bums like, yeah, we didn't do that. Or I was like, they
Right.
still say that they didn't play I Want You to Want Me. It's the last second. He's like, yeah, it's
Right. I
just
got
like
it. I
He's
got
not
it.
from Venezuela, which thank God, by
Right.
the way,
Which,
given the political climate, that Bun is not Brad Carlson is not from Venezuela because I don't know what would
right.
be happening to his relatives right now.
Right. Which is God, your timing is perfect because you just made me think of this. One of my laugh out loud moments in the book was and I never heard this quote from Bunny before or heard it mentioned quite this way, was he said, the reason why I changed my name from Carlson to Carlos, he goes, otherwise it would have sounded like a bunch of Swedes. And I laughed
And
my
they
ass
are,
off over that.
right?
And they
All
are a
four of them
bunch of
are.
Swedes.
Right,
Yes.
there's a restaurant, I forget the name of it. It's in Rockford, right? They serve like that Rick owned. That like, yeah, they
Yeah.
are. And then
Yeah.
also
But
clearly,
just the way you put that was
yeah,
hilarious. And
yeah, it's funny to even see. I mean, I was looking at old Billboard articles recently, just thinking about doing a second book, and like when they're first introduced in Billboard, it says that like, yeah, he's from Venezuela. And it's very funny, as you mentioned, being Jewish. When I went through all of my descriptions of Bun, which I have to say, I came up with that idea not knowing that Brian was going to do something like that as well. I was like, oh, I came up with like a 2 pages of like all the really like insulting, usually about his hairline or weight,
Right.
about insulting.
And the clothes you hear it.
Right.
Yeah.
And Brian's like, I did the same thing. And then there were a couple, and again, this was obviously when the movie Boys from Brazil came out. Like nobody was suggesting that Bun was actually like a Nazi, but they just came up with every version of like him having, a mustache. So they're like, he looks like he's hiding like in South America.
Right.
And in fact, he was like, "Are you sure you want to put this?" I said, "Well, I'm Jewish. I think they know that I'm kidding." I was like, "You can take it out." But yeah, pretty much every like the janitor, the teacher, the accountant,
Accountant,
you know,
insurance sale,
right.
an insurance salesman on a Jag after a convention. I mean,
Exactly. Some of them are very descriptive, and I did ask him, because he has no kids. He has tons of nephews and nieces. I did say like, in Wake Up with a Monster, they do make fun of you on Beavis and Butthead. He's like, yes. He's like, I got a lot of like play from my like younger, that was very
sure.
favorite because I think the exact quote I put it in there was the drummer looks like the guy who would basically bogart all the beer.
Yeah, yeah.
But
Well,
yeah, yeah. Sorry.
I was gonna say that's a good launch point, and we can, wrap up after this. I could talk about this for hours, and that's a huge portion of my life is talking about Cheap Trick for hours, for
They are
decades
fascinating.
now. But the Beavis and Butthead, there was from the mid '90s on, and I think it's been deservedly so musically because I think they've after Epic, from say Woke Up with a Monster on, they've consistently delivered some. I can quibble with almost each of them, but they have consistently developed in the second half. You can say, uh, you know, consistently the second half of their career, consistently delivered some really powerful music,
Right. It
some
sounds
really
like
good
Cheap
music.
Trick. It doesn't sound like
Exactly.
Cheap Trick in 1883. It sounds like
Right.
Cheap Trick, which is
Right.
their own
And,
genre.
no record label pressures, and, but one of the things that I've been so thankful for, and it felt so almost, for me, especially as, who, as a fan, that, like I said, I was the only kid wearing an, Next Position Please t-shirt, was just them getting the deserved accolades and
The
the
flowers that
respect.
the kids say.
Yes, from I mean, the list is so lengthy. It has been going on. Mike McCready obviously wrote the forward for your book, but you got, you know, Billy Corgan, Dave Grohl, the name check on, Beavis and Butt. That's Mike Judge,
Yeah,
and
100%.
the it's it's deserved, and I think, and of course,
It
the
started
Rock
with
and Roll Hall
Fast
of
Times,
Fame,
right?
the Rock
Right.
and Roll Hall
Fast
of
Times was
Fame,
meant
yeah.
to be a name check, but it also did, like you said, represent the fact that they were behind the times. But
But
yes, I mean,
yeah, but it's great that they've, there was a long period of time where I don't think they got that respect, where everybody focused on the decline, or miss kind of kind of, I would say, misnomered, if you will, what Budokan. Oh, they're a one-hit wonder. No,
100%.
they're not. That's not true. Or they were a fluky act or whatever. Because in one of the things in kind of the last, like, say, 25 years, especially from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction, all that, is that when you look back on their career from even the pre-Cheap Trick days with Fuse and everything and Grim Reapers and all that, I mean, you're hard pressed to find a band that ever worked harder than these guys.
100%.
I mean, they've been called blue collar, Midwestern work ethic, you name it. But
Yeah,
and they
Protestant
will
for a
joke
bit.
about that they're too dumb to quit. And I gotta believe that. And I've heard Tom say, who sometimes can just be absolutely hilarious. And him and Rick, I can see why they become, they're such good friends, and uh, because they've got that very same sardonic sense of humor.
Right.
But I've heard Tom say in an interview one, I can't remember where it was, like, what the hell else am I going to do? Am I going to be a dentist?
Right.
And they were working musicians, and they made a career out of it, no matter how low the lows were.
Right, and
And
that Too Dumb to Quit is perfect because it also is much like you said, the Rick, the Rick shtick, which created Exhibit itself,
right,
you know, that totally masks the realities. They're not too dumb to quit. They're very, I mean, I would anticipate that Rick probably has the most money because he's just constantly
well, in the publishing, sure.
right, the branding of Rick Nielsen, which he still, but I'm saying I don't think that's why they still do it. But yeah, Too Dumb to Quit was always like their way of, like I said, kind of shrugging off. I'm sure some of the pain of stuff that didn't hit. I mean, that's the reality was, maybe. I mean, like I said, I saw a full thread that is still going on Steve Hoffman forums. Like, was Cheap Trick the first alternative band, or are they underrated or overrated? How is that possible? And they continue to inspire that kind of like barroom debate. But yeah, I
They're
mean,
definitely not underrated. I think for a long, long time
they're
prior to
underrated
this,
if you only know the one thing that everybody knows.
right. but I think for a long, long time, what it was up until this, what I call the mid '90s resurgence, was underappreciated. And
Yeah.
that has totally changed, and for good reason. Because the whole body of work, it's two buckets, right? This amazing live act, which nobody was, if anybody who has ever said I was disappointed seeing Cheap Trick live, okay, maybe on an off night, but if you know rock and roll and you've seen him more than once,
Right. Even like on the Doctor tour, like when people say, "Well, I didn't love that album" or "I hated that
they
album," like
live they
either
brought it.
right,
So there's that
never love
bucket.
it.
Yeah, there's that bucket, but then, musically over the span of 20 albums, I mean, it's amazingly high quality stuff. It goes beyond first four studio records. There's gems on every single one. Even the Doctor, I can tell you, I still love
Right.
It's Only Love, and was it a disappointment for me after Standing on the Edge, which to me, sound wise and song wise, I thought was a nice comeback. And Tonight It's You, I will go to my grave saying, there's a small group of songs where it's absolutely a goddamn crime that were not
Right, like
massive hits.
Voices. I mean, they're right.
And Tonight It's You is one of those.
I think Robert Christgau, who just I think celebrated a birthday, I feel like, and he talked a lot of I think he had said that, like, how was that? Yes, I
Right,
think it's the Beatles, but I think he said even I who have trashed them, like, how did that not become a hit? I mean,
right. And so that's the thing. I mean, so they're certainly appreciated now, deservedly so. And, now when we spent a lot of time on the same Cheap Trick page, what's the band doing last year? Why wasn't there a 50th anniversary? And well, it's going to be 2025 because that's when Robin came into the band, 75 or whatever it was. And, now we're almost midway through the year, and is this a farewell tour or isn't? And now it's 4 years between albums. There's an album done. In a weird way, I kind of admire this as much as I see the lost opportunity, and both as a fan and as a marketing and promotions person who's been in entertainment. When I think of the things they could or should, or what I'd love to see them doing, is I love the fact that they're kind of immune to this. They will do it on their own timetable now.
yeah,
And I would love it if they never announce the traditional Kiss like farewell tour.
I don't think they will. I think I think
Go until you can't, you stop, and that's
I
it.
think I think they're aware of. Again, and we can talk about this another time, but I think you'd agree with this. I mean, the connection with Kiss. Again, they did not put them on the album as a shout out to Kiss. They put them on the album because the name Kiss worked. It could have been Queen,
Right.
we're talking about, and of course Gene, who never sees an opportunity not to pat himself on the back. I mean, they definitely appreciate Kiss. They learned a lot from Kiss. Obviously, they love being on the Love Gun tour. They learned how to treat fans. But I am sure, and Rick's made jokes about it, that they look at Kiss and the Kiss coffins, even though they played a Kiss cruise, Cheap Trick did.
Right.
I am sure the idea of announcing an avatar, like even Rick, who jokes about playing anywhere and anytime, is probably like, yeah, we don't want to do that. So
And I also think they're aware too, especially Kiss being the obvious example of this, is that the farewell tours last freaking nearly a decade, for
right,
God's sakes,
yeah,
and like I said
who have
before,
been on it since '82. I mean,
yeah, when you're in your 70s and 80s, 70s, and you're doing it this long, you're essentially on a farewell tour. It's just not announced. It's going to end, I mean, so and I love the fact that in a time period where every band wants to milk every single penny out of it, they're going to go out on their own terms, and they're going to go out on their own terms, both musically, I think professionally, with so much love and
they
admiration
do
from their
have an album
peers.
coming out, right? Well,
Yeah,
they haven't
yeah.
announced it to me, but I know
The album's done.
yeah,
Yeah.
I
The
know
album's
Jackson. Yeah,
Yeah, the album's supposedly done. And the way they've worked doing albums I'd say, like, from Bang Zoom Crazy Hello, right, which was the first album in many years, 2016, that coincided with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
yeah. It
You
was
know,
without Buddy. It was after the latest, and then
right. Yeah. But they work with Julian Raymond. He's got a co-write on every song now.
right,
He's their producer. That seems to be right or wrong. I can quibble with some stuff,
right.
but for the most part, I think the records have had some good quality, and there's some really good material on there. But they tend to record during, they'll it spurts, I guess. Tom
Right.
lives in Nashville. Julian's they record in Nashville, and we're gonna do, we got a couple weeks off. We're gonna do some tracks. We're gonna do this. So there's never one time now with Julian Raymond where they go into the studio and we're gonna go spend 2 months and do a record. So
Right.
I'm told this record has been done now for a while. Dax has mentioned it as
Yeah.
well. So, you got it.
But
Hopefully,
I do not think they would bill it. I'm sure you saw the same thing I did. The Japan shows were billed as their farewell Japan shows, and I think, like you said, I don't think once they got word of that, they were like, oh wait, what we really meant. I think
they're not leaning into that.
right. They wouldn't do that. I mean, I'm sure the Japanese may have marketed it that way, like, hey, come see them before you can't, which is really unfortunately the marketing for every band of that age. I mean,
Yeah.
they don't put it on the poster like come see them before they're gone. I mean,
Yeah.
I know some people. I try to never think of that stuff, but
My reasons for why that they're still my all-time favorite band of all time, which I should probably trademark that line, is
yes.
remain this way. I mean, since I discovered them when I was a kid, and most Cheap Trick fans of my vintage, uh, the fans that have always loved them, it's been that way because of ultimately, I think because of the music, and that's what counts the most. So
And the things that probably that you probably get frustrated with by them as a fan, as someone who wants to see them do more, and somebody who professionally works in the field, is probably part of the stuff that you also like about them. You like this, it's like one of those great lines that in Old School when Vince Vaughn's like, Dean Pritchard's playing hardball, but like I kind of respect it. Like you probably on
yeah,
one hand you're like I have to respect it, but she's just doing shit that runs counter to what other bands are doing, which
right.
I don't know that it's a conscious thing. I mean. Like I said, I don't think Rick thinks about. I mean, like you said, if somebody presented him today with an authorized Cheap Trick book where he was going to tell all, first of all, I don't think he'd be like, I mean, there are so many people that would buy that. I mean, like
Yeah.
I said, every little bit of, like you said, collector type stuff that they put out. I mean, it would definitely get snatched up. Like
And he's a hoarder by his own admission. The
oh
guy has
yeah, Wayne's
everything.
Pennies. I mean, look at the whiskey box.
Yeah.
That came out, and I bought a copy, and and it hasn't been re-released, and people are like frothing at the mouth for it. Like why
Yeah.
isn't I'd asked Timothy J. Smith, who huge Cheap Trick fan who works for Sony Legacy, and I was like, I think they know like people would buy if it came out tomorrow in some limited form, people would buy that. If they just put
Yeah.
a different picture on it, people would buy it.
Having said all that, and there's probably economic reasons for it not happening, but I would like to see, Sony Legacy did such a great job with the reissues, and I
Yeah.
would love to see a few more albums post Dream Police where they do that again, So that
Yeah,
would
I mean,
the
maybe
old
is that
Epic records.
right? Maybe there's some legal entanglements. Who knows?
Yeah.
Like I said, I mean, they keep all the whiskey tapes. Bun confirmed. Like they really were just sitting in a locker, and they really had no intention of like doing anything when they did it. I was like, you guys had the Wally Hyder truck there at the whiskey for 4 shows, and with Werman, and you wanted to like get live ready, have them in the studio, and you just weren't going to do anything with it. And you read some of those interviews, like with Carrie Baker, and of course, very ironic and prophetic. I think Tom was like, "Oh, who wants a boring live album?" Well, jokes on you.
Right.
Like a boring live album is basically what's made and broken your entire life.
Right. Boy, if that's not the most ironic quote to
Yeah,
sum
I
up
mean,
sum up
maybe
everything now.
right. So, but
Yeah.
that's crazy to me that those tapes just sat around.
Yeah.
And I mean, again, like I know Robert Lawson, his book. I mean, he was very specific about what tracks came from where, and there are people who were really waiting for that to happen. I mean, anytime you mention it, I know you can stream Out to Get You 2 CD version, but
Right.
the four actual discs, they're not out there on any streaming service. I mean, when they said limited, they were not fucking around.
No, no, they meant it. So,
Back in the vault, it's like
yeah.
Cinderella. They're not there will be no second,
Right. Well, Ross, thank you so much, man. I
pleasure.
I really appreciate this. Where can people find you as far as what you got going
Sure. I
on?
am on I'm on Twitter, or formerly Xbox called Twitter. I'm on Luca B12, pretty much on anything. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Blue Sky. I'm confused with the Element song of the same name. On the Instagram, it's Drunk on Sunday, the book, which is my first book. I am trying to put out more kind of like archival stuff. I did a little bit. I have a blog, pictures that I didn't get a chance to use because I don't know about Quattro. But like with Backbeat, it was very difficult to get like releases, of pictures. I noticed Jillian Gar's book has a great photo of Springsteen, which my wife loves Bruce. So I'm gonna get the picture for him. I was like, oh, Bob Alford, he did the pictures like of Cheap Trick and Kiss, and I was like, I'm
Right.
trying to. Ken had shared with me some great pictures that he took for him that I couldn't find Bob Alford. He may be deceased, but they can find me Luca B12 on Twitter, Ross Warner on Facebook. I think I'm Luca B12 on Blue Sky. It's Luca Brasi. That's where the Luca B comes from. And then
Sure.
12 is Stan Humphries of the Chargers. So I've had that since I had an AOL account. And then I have a Wix site. So I'm debating. I think I will definitely write a second book because, as you pointed out, a lot of the things that people really liked was what ended up being the end of this book, which was Cheap Trick through the years. And you mentioned like the meta, the Easter egg. It's like like Zelig or Forrest Gump, like were they really ever out of it? They pop up
Right.
on Hello, they pop up on Check Your Head Beasties. Like I said, Rick was in Disorderlies. He was an episode of Boy Meets World.
And there's amazing stories there. I mean, a whole chapter could, I think, and should be written about how and why Tom came back in the band,
Yeah. Right,
and
and that story is not, and that is
and
not.
John Brandt leaving, who's never talked
Yes.
about it,
No, not
and
at all. And Bunn played with John Brand. I'm sure you saw.
sure he plays it married. Yeah, they
Yeah, I was talking to I mean, right. I mean, and Ira said, I'm not speaking tales of Ira Robbins said, yeah, that story about being at Julie Lennon's birthday and spilling a beer on his lap, that's too convenient. Like even he's like, that's bullshit. Like
I had the pleasure in my previous gig meeting many years ago and talking with the now late and wonderful Don Grierson, who was the
yeah,
A&R guy at Epic. But
sure.
prior to that, he was the A&R guy for Capitol at Heart. And so he came to Epic in '87. And from what I've always understood and known, he was a big part of, engineered. It's like if we're going to, after the Doctor, it's like something needs to change.
Right.
And I started for CBS Records in '88, so it was right after Lap of Luxury came out, and being able to collect all that stuff, to order it directly through,
Yeah.
order as a rep for the company. But I could, the excitement that Tom was back, not only as a fan, but within the company was really palpable. And that was part of the marketing campaign. I mean, that was part of Tom is back.
Yeah.
The band is cracking again. So,
100%.
and it was also that Grierson formula. We're going to use some outside riders. We're going to smooth this out a bit, and we're gonna swing for the fences with a massive hit single that, sorry, you guys didn't write, but it's going to bring you back,
Right.
and it's going to make you a concert draw again, and ultimately end up being a great positive for you guys. However long, the interesting thing is they never really talk about that, and they've never really went on record or talked about Don Grierson
I saw his name. I was looking at old billboards. You mentioned it, and again, since you were in the industry, the picture, the ad, which
yeah,
has Tom in it. It says like the history of Cheap Trick is still being written.
yeah,
I saw a picture with Ken and Manny, and them holding up the records. Again, it's an amazing kind of not symmetry, but like 10 years after Budokan, once again, as I put in the book, they're famous for something they didn't want.
right.
Well, and again, Rick said in 1988, the interview with the LA Times, like, we've been down more than we've been up. We've come back more than we've been on top, and which I find very funny. And the Flame. I mean, I don't love the Flame. I will be honest. To me, it isn't Cheap Trick. I think they do a great job, but they made it their own. There's a cool guitar solo in it.
Yeah.
Again, I was 17 when the Flame came out, and if you had told me, especially, I mean, some of those. Robin's hair and some of the fringe. I mean, it was very 1988. So,
Sure.
and
But I can tell you
again,
the fact that they got so much exposure made me feel so good, and I got to say I
right,
told you so. And
exactly.
it was a #1 hit single. It
What I love,
brought
and
me
they weren't
back.
playing it all the time. That's what I love is that you look
Right.
at and I do love it again. But that part of that is just so Rick because I mean, he has told the story many times. Did he crush the demo with his shoe? I put it in there. That's what he said. He said it many times. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I'll send it to you because I just found it's either Kerrang or a Billboard article, which you probably have, but it's like of that time where it talks about like, oh, Cheap Trick's just another example of they're repackaging all this stuff. Like now we're putting Joan Jett back in the leather, and
Right.
I know Gruesome did he work with Hart? I mean, I know Hart was on Epic,
Yeah, he was. Yeah, well,
right? So their
but
reimagining was very much
right when they blew up, when they came back, that was on
right,
Capitol Records, Alone and
right.
Never and all that. Their comeback, that big comeback, was post Epic with Capitol. Grierson was the A&R guy. Then he goes to Epic for a
It
few
was kind of to
years.
say, yeah. I mean, and similarly, I know somebody posted on one of the Cheap Trick pages, the Tequila Sunrise single. I don't know where Robin's hair ends and Ann's begins.
No,
I'm always saying that out of jealousy, but yeah, it is pure on so 80s. But yeah, there is so much, like I said, about Cheap Trick, and that has been the biggest thing people said to me. Well, why wasn't that and the font size? Why wasn't the book longer? I was like, because somebody, gave me a book deal, and they said, I mean, if it makes anybody feel any better, they told me the book length, and then I went back and put a lot of shit in they didn't know about. I was like, oh, it's very important that I put in that Howard Hessman was in the Troy Angela's movie that came out exactly that time. I was like, I'm putting that in. And Wayne McCormick was so sweet, who worked for Rolling Stone, was like, do you really need to make a reference to like, Harry's hair, from Mad Men. I was like, yes, that has to go on. Like buns, I was like, she's like, really? I'm like, because those are my little flourishes. I was
Yeah.
like, you got to know it's me. I was like, I
Yeah,
can't.
you were bumping up against publishing P&L. So, the
Oh,
more
I
the
mean,
more pages, the more pages, the more it costs, maybe a
there was a
different trim
lot of it was.
size.
It was
You need to
very. I
stay
mean, people
within
were
this.
very generous. I'm hoping on a second go around that more people who have heard about the book who would then want to participate. But like I said, I don't think you mentioned Tom leaving. You mentioned Tom coming back. The deal with Warner's, the deal not with Warner's, the parting with Ken. I mean, I'm not. I wouldn't go into it expecting anything other than what I got the first time. If somebody wants to be more forthright on the record, that's fine. But I'm not looking to this isn't going to be like I'm not going to force anybody. I mean, and that's unfortunate because there are people that will be like, "Well, how legit is this book? He didn't talk to them, And I was like, "Do you know anything about Cheap Trick?" I'm like, "Ask
Right.
anybody who's worked with them." I was like, I want to know, but it's amazing because a lot of their attempts at preservation work. Like I said, if you go onto forums, people will say they're the one the band that didn't party. I was like, well, that's not true. They're the one band that didn't talk shit about each other. I'm like, that's definitely not true. You know, and then they openly said like, when Behind the Music was a thing, like we don't want to be one of those bands. And I think that's I mentioned in the book them keeping it in house. The way a team
Right.
might have locker room or clubhouse issues, but they don't want the rest of the world. I mean,
Right.
I think, and like I said, I mean, Bun, I know went to Robin Taylor's, gig in Madison. I know him and Ken communicate. I certainly did not for a long time.
And
But
clearly I was very surprised and it made me very happy to see Bunny's Bootlegs YouTube content
yes,
being shared on the official
right,
Cheap
right. And
page.
I would
I was
extend, yeah, 100%. And I think, again, even though I do not for one second think that the principals spoke on that. I know Steve who helps Bun. Somebody asked him recently. I was on Facebook, like, is this a kosher? Are they allowed to do this? And they're like, yeah. I mean, obviously, doing a Cheap Trick, Bun wouldn't get
right.
the ire of any more legal. I would assume that maybe part of the settlement was that certainly that the Bun could keep the recordings, whether or not. But you mentioned if they did a box set of that tomorrow, where all that stuff was made available, people would 100% buy it. Now,
Oh,
why hasn't that happened? I don't know. Is it because they're Bun's actual recordings? I asked him when I went through the Budokan audiences, and they wrote back. He wrote back to me like, "Oh, I have my own reference port." So I was like, well, people would love to hear that. I was like, if you went out tomorrow and said this track is from here, I tried to do an A/B with Osaka and figure out where each rendition's from. I mean, the stage patter you can tell. I'm not going to write about it on the 28th. I mean, I don't know if it's anything. I mean, I can share a track. I mean, all I can say is the screaming is really loud. I mean, is it louder on the official version? Yeah. I mean, I think Jack Douglas has said they mixed it so that you could
right.
individual. And it appears like they're screaming Bunny a lot, which is interesting. It's like they know which one Bunny is, right?
Right.
I mean, even Bunny would say, that but yeah, it is great to see that the socials, have shared it because they didn't for a while. For about the first year,
Right.
I was, and then now they posted.
Which gave me a sigh of relief because every Monday I'd be like, man, he's
They're
putting
gonna
out
shut it
another one,
down,
another
right?
one.
They're gonna
And
shut
it's
it
been
down.
so regular, and I'm like, this is gonna come down. This is gonna disappear.
100%. Oh yeah. I mean,
And then I was like, I breathed a sigh of relief when Cheap Trick started
downloaded
sharing
every
it.
version in MP3. I'll say that right now.
Right.
I made sure to keep. I've kept everyone like just in case. Which of course, it's also why I have 13 hard drives. I mean,
Right, right.
but yeah, just in case they take it down. I got to make sure I have it. But yeah, I mean, it is good to see them getting along in that way. And like I said, that some of the personalities are starting to, thaw a little. I mean, again, like I said, we talked about Ken, we talked about Tom. The same thing with Bun. I mean, the story there, like I said, people ask, like, do you know what happened? I mean,
Well, that got very public during the Rock and Roll Hall of
right,
Fame when Bunny took a phone call
kindergarten
from a
story.
Rolling Stone
Yeah,
reporter. It was like at
yeah,
9 o'clock in the morning, So that
right.
was one where everybody
Andy
went,
Green,
"Oh
sure.
my gosh!"
Right. And that, that of course is the genius of it is that during the height of their fame, Rick and Tom have that room and in Japan and Bunny and Robin are roommates, which again,
Yeah,
they joke about Bunny being cranky. But in their induction speech when they spoke, I believe Rick made a joke like, Bunny, you don't need to change the channel again or whatever. So
right, right.
I don't think they were like ever close, but the mere fact that Bunny is going, like I said, to Robin Taylor's gig, with Jack Douglas producing. That to me, and I was not in the room with any of them. That to me, just like I always thought Bunny Carlos was the coolest. I could be wrong here. He just, I never hear anybody say that like he's some duplicitous dude. And I thought that was certainly being the bigger party. So I don't think he wants to be touring with them now. I don't think he wanted to be touring with them necessarily post South by Southwest. I could be wrong there. He also didn't want to have to sue them. He may have thought, I don't know, that maybe he was going to be like the recording drummer. I mean, he's never spoken on this to me.
Right.
Me from, the same conversation that you got into. I mean, he didn't want it to get this ugly.
No.
And yes, I believe once the lawsuit was settled and they agreed to all four be together, once he told that story about, now we're dealing with your daughter's fucking kindergarten classes. I mean, he had to know, that was going to be it. And that's when, he started referring to Robin as the singer. And that's when I would assume behind the scenes when that occurred, there was I will play with that guy. And what is Cheap Trick going to do? I mean, they clearly are not going to not have Robin Zander. They clearly have decided to not tour Buddy Carlos. I believe that's probably, I assume there was some My Way or the Highway. I'm going all Dalton Roadhouse now on you.
It always sounded that way. So, but anyway, like I said, 20 minutes later,
like, what did I have to do today? Oh, the sun's still out.
Yeah, no, I know. I was going to do some yard work. So, but Ross,
I was definitely not doing yard.
Thank you so much, man.
My pleasure. Yeah, we'll be in touch. Like I said,
yeah,
it was an absolute. It was an absolute pleasure. And like I said to everybody who is a longtime Cheap Trick fan, I consider myself one. But there's been a real welcoming, like I said, spirit, because people are asking me like, well, you must be like the biggest Cheap Trick fan. I'm like, no, I'm like, I won an award for being the biggest Charger fan. I'm like, and I'm a big Deadhead, but in Deadhead terms, I'm not, an award winner. So Cheap Trick fans are a very, very dedicated, finicky, detail-oriented bunch, and people have been like super cool to me, which was something that I was concerned about because Doug Broad, Rub for Spin, Bryant has a podcast. Robert Lawson's super meticulous. His book has all sorts of B-sides.
It's a good community.
So right. So I was like, how are they going to react to me? Like, what's your shtick? I'm like, I don't know. I have fucking Thunderball poster behind me. A couple dead posters, my elliptical, and you can see the Dream Police one at the bottom, which I bought that on eBay, but that's the one that says it's a crime you had to wait the time, which I used as a chapter heading because I was not able to use actual song titles. That was another thing they told me. Like you can only quote in a couplet, and I was like, I don't know what that means. I was like, I'll just use Better Than TV, like every Epic, So if somebody from Epic in the 70s comes after me for that.
Yeah. All right, man.
We'll be in touch.
right, hope you enjoyed my conversation with Ross Warner, author of American Standard. I'll tell you, that ran about 20-25 minutes longer than I originally anticipated. By the end of it there, I was going to have bladder failure. I loved talking to him. I could have talked to him for another 2 hours, and easily, I love talking about Cheap Trick, as I think you probably could tell within minutes of the episode. So, once again, thank you for checking out the podcast. Be sure to check out American Standard by Ross Warner, available everywhere books are sold. Links are all in the show notes. And as always, be good to yourself and be good to other people. Take care.